Lesson 5.3. Verify trigonometric identities. So this time we're going to take these identities and some complicated ones and show that they are true. The process of doing this, you turn one side into the other side. So you work with just one side at a time. So you work with one side at a time, starting with the more complicated side. And then you try to factor, add fractions, square a binomial, etc. Try using fundamental identities. If none of that stuff works, try writing the whole thing in just sines and cosines. And last of all, try something. If you just sit there and stare at it, nothing's going to happen. You're not going to get it. You need to try something. So let's verify this. The more complicated side looks like the left side to me. So hey, what could we do? I don't know. Maybe multiply them. So let's multiply them. We'll have 1 times 1. 1 times negative sine alpha. 1 times positive sine alpha. And negative sine alpha squared. Well, the negative sine alpha and the plus sine alpha cancel out, and I have 1 minus sine squared alpha. And then I'm reminded of the Pythagorean identity because I want to make it cosine squared. So it's sine squared plus cosine squared equals 1. So if I subtract sine squared from both sides, I'll get cosine squared equals 1 minus sine squared. So that is simply cosine squared. All right, so what's the answer? The answer is actually showing the work. The answer is actually showing the steps. Let's try this one. All right, so you look at what side's more complicated. They're equally complicated, so I'm going to start with the left side. And since they both have a sine squared on the left side, I think I'm going to factor out a sine squared, leaving 1 minus sine squared. Well, sine squared u plus cosine squared u is 1. If I subtract the cosine squared, I'll get sine squared is 1 minus cosine squared. So where the sine squared is, I'm going to put 1 minus cosine squared. So the 1 minus the 1 will cancel out, and then I've got minus a negative, that'll become positive. And then I could distribute. I'd have 1 times cosine squared minus cosine squared times cosine squared would be cosine to the 4th. Look at that. That's the other side. So we're done. Let's try this one. Have to decide which side's more complicated. I don't know. So I'm just going to start with the left side. And on the left side, I notice there's a cotangent on top and cosecant on the bottom. So it's like, well, I know an identity that has cotangent and cosecant. I know that cotangent squared plus 1 is cosecant squared. So where the cotangent, so if I subtract the 1, then I'll have cotangent squared is cosecant squared minus 1. So I'll replace the cotangent squared with cosecant squared minus 1. Well, I could split that fraction into 2 separate fractions. And cosecant squared divided by cosecant is simply cosecant. And I know that 1 over cosecant is sine. So that other part would become sine. And look at that. That's what we're trying to get. Let's try one more. And then one more after this one. All right, what side's more complicated? I don't really know, but I'm going to use the left side. I know that 1 over secant is cosine, so that part is cosine. And I know 1 over tangent is cotangent, so that part is cotangent. Well, it doesn't look like what we're trying to get to. So what could we do? Maybe we could write these as all sines and cosines. I know cotangent is cosine over sine. So I have cosine over 1 and cosine over sine. So on top, that would give me cosine squared. Oh, but I know that sine squared plus cosine squared equals 1. So then cosine squared must be 1 minus sine squared. So on the top, I can write it as 1 minus sine squared. I could split that into 1 over sine and sine squared over sine. I know 1 over sine is cosecant, so 1 over sine is cosecant, and sine squared over sine is simply sine. And look at that. That's the other side. That's what we're trying to get. So see, when we verify, you pick one side and you turn it into the other side. Let's try one more. The left side this time is definitely the more complicated. And I think what I'll do is I will turn everything into sines and cosines. So cotangent is cosine over sine. So I'll have cosine theta times cosine theta over sine theta. So on the top, that would be cosine squared theta over sine. And then, I don't know, what could we do? I know that let's change the cosine to a sine. So I know that sine squared plus cosine squared is 1. So thus cosine squared is 1 minus sine squared. So on the top, I could change that to 1 minus sine squared over sine over 1 minus sine. Oh, I've forgotten this minus 1 all the way down. So minus 1 there. Okay. Well, let's simplify this fraction sum. So 1 minus sine squared over sine, and then it's divided by 1 minus sine. So that would be times 1 over 1 minus sine. So on the top, I have 1 minus sine squared. The bottom, I have sine times 1 minus sine, minus 1. Oh, hey, the top is a difference of squares. It's 1 squared minus sine squared. So I can make it 1 minus sine, 1 plus sine. The 1 minus sine cancels out. So I have 1 plus sine over sine minus 1. Well, I could split up the fraction to be 1 over sine plus sine over sine minus 1. Oh, but wait, sine over sine is 1. So the cancels out, and 1 over sine is cosecant. And look at that, we have made it all the way to the end. That's it for this lesson. Have a good day.